Somewhere in the Mekong Delta, on a moonless night late in the 1960s, a small line of men lowered themselves into a canal until the warm, black water closed over their chests. They did not speak. They barely moved. Their faces were smeared in green and black, so that even at arm's length, a man looks like a smudge in the reeds, rather than a face. They had come by boat and slipped off it without a splash, and now they waited, motionless, for a sampan that intelligence said would pass before dawn. The men who lived in these villages had a name for soldiers like these. They called them the men with green faces. They spoke the name, the way you speak of something that comes in the dark and leaves nothing behind but the memory of fear. This is the story of how an ordinary young volunteer, one of thousands of real men who walked the same path, became one of those men. Not through a single act of courage in a famous battle, but through a long, unglamorous education in patience, silence, and the discipline of staying alive in a place that punished every mistake. It is the story of the United States Navy SEALs in Vietnam and of what it actually took to earn a place among them. To understand the man in the canal, you first have to understand a strange truth about him. He was not sent to war. He asked for it. Across the wider war in Vietnam, the machine that fed the fight ran largely on conscription. Roughly a quarter of the Americans who served were drafted, pulled from their towns and factories and classrooms, and moved along a vast assembly line toward the jungle. The typical soldier was young, often 19, and often unwilling. The SEAL was the exact opposite kind of man. No one could be drafted into the teams. A man had to raise his hand, and then he had to keep raising it, again and again, through months of a training program designed from the ground up to make him quit. That difference shaped everything. The Navy SEALs were established in January of 1962, created as SEAL Team 1 at Coronado, California on the Pacific side, and SEAL Team 2 at Little Creek, Virginia on the Atlantic. Pre-sea. The name was an acronym for sea, air, and land. The three ways these men were meant to arrive at a target. It had first appeared in a Navy memo in 1961, a proposed cover name for a new kind of commando who could come from the water, from the sky, or across the ground. President John Kennedy had pushed hard for forces like this, units built for unconventional and counter-guerrilla warfare rather than for the great set-piece battles the Army had trained for. There is a popular story that Kennedy created the SEALs specifically for Vietnam. It makes a clean legend, but it is not quite true. The teams grew out of something older, and their founding was the work of many hands. Their real ancestry ran back to the Second World War. In the Pacific, after the terrible landing at Tarawa in 1943 revealed how little the Navy knew about the reefs and obstacles in front of its beaches, the fleet built the Underwater Demolition Teams. These were the men history remembers as the naked warriors, swimmers who went in with little more than fins, a mask, a knife, and a slate to map the surf and blow the obstacles before the Marines came ashore. They first saw combat in the Marshall Islands in 1944. Behind them stood other units cut from the same cloth. The Scouts and Raiders formed at Little Creek in 1942. The Naval Combat Demolition Units, whose men cleared the obstacles at Normandy and paid for that beach in blood, taking losses that ran to roughly half their number on a single morning. And the Maritime Branch of the Wartime Intelligence Service, which experimented with swim fins, closed diving rigs, and mines fixed to the hulls of enemy ships. The SEAL inherited all of it. He was the newest link in a chain of American frogmen that stretched back to the beaches of Normandy and the reefs of the Pacific. The men who built the first teams became legends inside the community. But Roy Boehm, a hard former enlisted diver, commissioned as an officer, was the first officer in charge of SEAL Team 2 and is often called the first SEAL and the father of the teams. He handpicked his original men and got himself hauled before more than one board of inquiry for buying rifles on the open market and bending the Navy's rules to arm his people the way combat actually demanded. Harry Beale is remembered as the very first man to volunteer. Rudy Boish, another founding member, would serve longer than almost anyone. These were not polished parade ground soldiers. They were rough, inventive, stubborn men who believed that the ordinary way of doing things would get their people killed. The gate a young volunteer had to pass through to join them was basic underwater demolition and SEAL training held on the beach at Coronado. It is still spoken of as one of the most punishing selection courses in the world, and it was built with a single ruthless purpose. It was not designed to teach a man to be tough. It was designed to find out whether he already was and to break everyone who was not. The course ran in phases. First came weeks of physical conditioning, the running and the swimming and the cold surf and the heavy rubber boats carried on the heads of exhausted men. Then came diving, and then land warfare, weapons, demolitions, and small unit tactics taught out on the islands. Threaded through the beginning was the part every man feared and every man had to face. They called it Hell Week. It ran for about 5.5 days with almost no sleep, perhaps 4 hours across the entire stretch, while instructors kept the candidates wet, cold, and moving through the sand and the water almost every hour of every day. The way out was always open, and that was the cruelty of it. In the middle of the training area stood a brass bell. Any man who wanted the pain to stop had only to walk over and ring it 3 times, and it would end. A warm blanket, hot coffee, a ride back to the regular Navy. The bell was there every single day. A standing invitation to quit, and most of the men who started the course eventually took it. The classes that began full-ended with only a fraction of their number still standing. What separated the man who finished from the man who rang the bell was almost never raw strength. It was something harder to measure, the simple refusal to stop. That refusal, repeated through the worst week of a young man's life, was the first thing that made us SEAL. It forged the small, fierce, closed brotherhood that would define everything the man did afterward, because every one of them had chosen the pain when he did not have to. And every one of them knew that the man beside him had chosen it too. Hell Week broke the crowd, but it did not finish the training. The men who remained went on into the water in earnest, learning to dive, to swim long distances beneath the surface, to stay calm when an instructor tied their hands and feet and dropped them into the pool to see whether they would panic. They learned to handle explosives, the old demolition craft that had given the frogmen their name. They shipped out to a rocky island off the coast for weeks of land warfare, live fire, patrolling and ambush drills, the closest thing the course could offer to the work waiting for them overseas. Only at the end of all of it did a man earn his place among the teams. Even then, he was not yet truly one of them. In the eyes of the veterans, he had earned the title, he had not yet earned the war. And yet, here is the paradox at the center of this story. A man could survive all of that, could earn the coveted place among the toughest volunteers in the Navy, and still arrive in Vietnam knowing almost nothing about the war he had come to fight. The training built the frame. The Delta would have to finish the man. SEAL involvement in Vietnam began quietly, years before the shooting started for most of them. Soon after the teams were formed, a handful of SEALs went across as advisors, sent to survey the country and to train South Vietnam's own maritime commandos, the Vietnamese frogmen. For a while, that was the whole mission, teaching and observing. Then, in February of 1966, the character of the work changed. A small detachment from SEAL Team 1 arrived to fight, operating from a base at Enche on the edge of a place that would become the crucible of the early SEAL War. It was called the Rung Sat Special Zone. The Rung Sat was a nightmare of a landscape, a vast tidal swamp of something like 485 square miles of mangrove northeast of the Mekong Delta proper. It was cut by thousands of streams and channels that braided together and came apart with the tides, a place where the ground itself was rarely solid and the water was rarely still. Its Vietnamese name meant, roughly, the salty forest. The Americans heard the name differently and called it the Forest of Assassins, and the grim nickname fit its reputation. For generations it had sheltered pirates, and now it sheltered the Viet Cong, who used its maze of waterways to threaten the vital shipping channel that ran up to Saigon. If you wanted to choke the enemy's grip on that channel, you had to go into the swamp after him. That was the SEAL's job. The first SEALs to die in Vietnam died in that early stretch of the war, and their names mark the true beginning of the cost. Commander Robert Fay was killed by a mortar round in October of 1965, the first SEAL lost in the country. The following August, in the Rung Sat, a point man named Billy Mason walked into an ambush ahead of his squad and opened fire alone to warn the men behind him, buying their lives with his own. He was the first SEAL killed while actually running a combat operation, and he was given the Silver Star. These were not distant statistics to the men who followed. They were the reason a new man was told over and over that the swamp did not forgive. As the SEALs learned the Rung Sat and began to break the enemy's hold on it, the demand for them grew, and they pushed south and west into the great flat country of the Mekong Delta itself. This was the rice bowl of the south, threaded with canals and dotted with villages, and it had been a stronghold of the communist movement for decades. It was ideal SEAL country, all water and cover and long, quiet nights, and it was here that the reputation of the men with green faces truly took root. To grasp how they came to be feared, you have to understand how completely they fought against the grain of the wider American war. The great strength of the United States in Vietnam was firepower, artillery, airstrikes, the ability to bring an overwhelming weight of metal down on a piece of ground. The typical operation moved large numbers of men into an area and relied on that firepower to do the killing. The SEAL did almost the reverse. He worked in tiny numbers, a squad of about 7 men, sometimes a full platoon of 14, and he traded firepower for stealth. He did not announce himself. He did not sweep. He slipped in at night, in ones and twos off a boat, and he became part of the landscape. Then he waited. There was an old saying among American troops that the night belonged to the enemy, that after dark the Viet Cong moved freely while the Americans hunkered down inside their wire. The SEAL set out to steal the night back. He preferred to work in the hours when his enemy felt safest, lying in ambush along a canal bank or a trail, sometimes for many hours, until a boat or a column of men came into the killing zone. The waiting was its own ordeal. A man might lie half submerged in the mud, with the tide creeping up his body and insects at his ears and leeches at his skin. And he could not slap, could not shift, and could not cough. He had to become part of the mangrove. When the ambush finally came, it was sudden and total and over in less than a minute, and then the men melted back into the dark and were gone before the enemy could gather a response. One veteran account distilled the whole idea into a single blunt phrase. The mission was to turn the ambusher into the ambushee. The tools the SEAL carried into that darkness were as unconventional as his tactics. The regular infantryman carried what the army issued him. The SEAL, by long tradition, carried what worked. His signature weapon was a light machine gun called the Stoner, a compact belt-fed weapon that let one man put out a stunning volume of fire for his size. It meant a 7-man squad could carry the striking power of a much larger unit, and the men loved it for exactly that reason. Alongside it, they carried short carbines for the point men, shotguns for the close brutal work, and belt-fed guns for the heavy weight of an ambush. Perhaps the most telling weapon of all was a small, suppressed pistol they nicknamed the Hush Puppy. Its name told you its purpose. It was quiet enough to kill a sentry's dog, or a sentry, without the shot rolling across the water to wake the whole village. The action could be locked, so that even the metallic clack of the slide would not give the shooter away. It was a weapon built entirely around the idea of silence. Even their clothing broke the rules. Many SEALs disliked the standard jungle fatigues and went into the swamp in well-worn blue denim jeans, which held up to the mud and the mangrove better and became a quiet mark of the tribe. They wore tiger-striped camouflage and soft hats rather than helmets. They rubbed green and black grease across their faces and the backs of their hands until no pale skin showed. Some sent home for pantyhose to wear under their clothes, not out of vanity, but as a thin barrier against the leeches that infested the canals. Every choice served the same master. Blend in, make no sound, leave no sign. Getting the SEAL to his hunting ground and getting him out again was a craft all its own, handled by the boat crews who worked with each platoon. These men ran a small fleet of low, fast support craft, along with river patrol boats, converted landing craft, and even plain fiberglass boats, and they learned to drop a squad at the water's edge and slide away with almost no noise. When an operation went wrong and a squad found itself pinned and outnumbered, help came from the air in the form of a Navy helicopter gunship squadron. The Sea Wolves stood up in the spring of 1967. The Sea Wolves flew fire support and pulled trapped SEALs out of tightening circles of enemy more times than anyone could count, and the men on the ground talked about those pilots like men who owed them their lives, because very often they did. But the deadliest thing about the SEAL was not any weapon or boat. It was information. The SEAL was, above all, an intelligence hunter, and his real targets were not random guerrillas in the field, but the specific men who made the enemy's shadow government work. The tax collectors, the political officers, the couriers and the local commanders. Killing a rifleman changed little. Capturing a district cadre and the papers in his pack could unravel an entire network. So the SEALs built their war on informants, on captured documents, and on partnerships that took them deep into the murk of the country's secret conflict. They worked closely with the provincial reconnaissance units, South Vietnamese paramilitary teams sponsored by American intelligence, which formed part of a wider and deeply controversial effort known as the Phoenix Program. The aim of that program was to identify and dismantle the enemy's underground infrastructure, and by the end of 1968, much of the reconnaissance work in the Delta was being led and advised by SEALs who might go out on a dozen or more missions in a single month with their Vietnamese teams. It was lonely, exposed duty, often a single SEAL far from any other American, trusting his life to men whose language he barely spoke. The program remains genuinely contested to this day. Its defenders point to the flow of intelligence it produced. Its critics condemned the way it blurred the line between soldier and something darker. An honest account has to hold both of those truths at once. The SEALs also relied on a particular kind of guide, a former enemy fighter who had changed sides, known as a Kit Carson scout. A man who had once moved through these villages as a Viet Cong knew things no map could show, which paths were watched, which houses were friendly, how the enemy thought. A platoon that earned such a scout's trust and gave its trust in return gained an edge that no amount of training could supply. The preferred method of the best of these units was not simply to kill, but to capture, because a prisoner could talk, and what he said pointed the way to the next target and the one after that. Sometimes the intelligence and the stealth came together in a single sharp blow. In May of 1967, a platoon from SEAL Team 2, led by a young officer named Richard Marcinko, struck a fortified island position in the Delta, killing a large number of Viet Cong and destroying a cluster of their sampans in a raid the Navy would call one of the most successful SEAL operations of the war in that region. Marcinko was a controversial figure, both then and long afterward, a genuine combat leader whose own later account of his life has to be read with care. But the shape of that operation was the shape of the SEAL war in miniature. Good information, a small team, a sudden overwhelming strike, and a fast withdrawal before any real defense could form. The SEALs did not do this work alone, and it would be a distortion to tell it as though they did. They fought alongside the South Vietnamese frogmen they had first come to train, skilled men who often walked point through their own country and who died in this war as well. They leaned on interpreters, on village informants, on the scouts who had changed sides, and on the boat crews and pilots who carried them in and pulled them out. The green-faced raider was the tip of a much larger and more tangled effort, and the best of them never forgot it. Now, put a brand new SEAL, fresh from training and untested in this country, into the middle of all this, and you begin to see the real education start. He arrived in country full of hard training and short on knowledge, and he stepped into a platoon where only a handful of the men had ever seen combat. A newly arrived platoon of 14 might have only 5 men who had already served a tour, with the rest, like him, new to it. His welcome was rarely gentle. One platoon arriving to relieve another, learned almost on landing that several SEALs had just been killed in a helicopter crash. There was no ceremony to it. The war simply informed you, on your first day, exactly what it was. What the new man had to learn could not have been taught on a California beach because it belonged entirely to this ground. He had to learn to read the Delta, to move through tidal mud without sucking sound, to tell a firefly from the shielded glow of an enemy's cigarette, to hold himself still for hours while his body screamed to move, to trust the tides and to fear the banks of the canals where the enemy laid booby traps for the careless. He had to unlearn the instinct, bred into every young man by a lifetime of war movies, to be the hero who charges forward. In this war, the man who charged forward died. And worse, he got the men beside him killed. The whole art was restraint. That knowledge came to him through the veterans of his platoon, the salty second and third tour men who had already survived what he was only now facing. These were often colorful, worn down, half-wild figures, men who had been shot and patched and sent back out, who broke every regulation about hair and dress in the rear and then became perfectly, lethally disciplined the moment they hit the water. They taught the new man in the only way that mattered, by example and by hard correction. And they watched him closely because a green seal who did not yet understand the ground was a danger to everyone around him until he did. Nothing tested him like his first real ambush. He would lie where the veterans placed him, in the mud along a canal, and the waiting would begin. An hour would pass, and then another. The tide would rise against his ribs. Mosquitoes would find the one patch of skin he could not cover. His legs would go numb beneath him, and every muscle would ache to shift its weight. And he could do none of it, because the smallest sound would travel a long way over open water at night and give the whole squad away. He learned that the hardest thing a SEAL did was often nothing at all, held perfectly, for as long as it took. And when the enemy finally came, a lowboat sliding out of the dark, exactly where the intelligence had promised, he understood the other half of it. That the strike, when it came, had to be instant and complete, and then finished, and that within moments the whole squad would be moving again, swallowed back into the mangrove before the sound had died. Trust in that world was not given. It was earned, one operation at a time. On his first patrols, the new man learned the true weight of the work, the crushing loads, and the heat that soaked a man within minutes, the specific misery of the swamp. He learned to keep his weapon dry and ready when he himself was neck-deep in filthy water. He learned to communicate with his hands and his eyes because a whisper could carry across still water and end them all. He learned to hold an ambush position long past the point where his mind begged him to give up, and he learned what it meant when the discipline of the man next to him held too. And slowly, across those first missions, something shifted. He stopped being a liability the others had to nurse along and became a pair of hands the squad could use. He carried his share of the load. He held his lane in the ambush. He did the small things right without being told. The change was not marked by any ceremony. It simply accumulated, night by night, until the veterans stopped watching him quite so hard. The men who reached the far end of that education became something the enemy learned to dread. Over roughly 6 years of heavy involvement, this small community, never more than a couple of hundred men in the country at any one time, accounted for around 600 enemy confirmed killed and perhaps 300 more almost certainly killed, along with many captured and a river of intelligence that shaped the wider fight. The larger command that counted such things credited the teams with killing or capturing some 4,000 enemy combatants over the war. Numbers like these got wrapped over the years in ever more dramatic legends about impossible kill ratios, and the honest historian treats the grandest of those claims with caution. But the core of it was real enough. A tiny number of men working unseen made the enemy afraid of the night in a way that mattered. The Viet Cong answered that fear, the way fear often answers, by putting a price on the men who caused it. Bounties were placed on the heads of the green-faced raiders. The exact sums that get quoted vary and are hard to pin down, and some of the most famous figures come from the memoirs of the SEALs themselves, rather than from captured enemy paper, so they are best held loosely. What is not in doubt is the reputation behind them. A guerrilla movement that ruled the countryside by owning the darkness had met an enemy who came out of that same darkness and did the ruling in reverse. That reversal was the whole point. The valor in that community reached its highest expression in 3 men who received the Medal of Honor, the nation's greatest award for combat bravery. In March of 1969, a young officer named Bob Kerry led a raid onto an island in the bay off Nha Trang. In the fighting, he was gravely wounded, losing part of a leg to a grenade blast, and yet he kept directing his split team through the fight until they seized their objective and the prisoners it held. He was decorated by the president the following year and went on, long after the war, to serve as a governor and a United States senator. In the spring of 1972, another SEAL, Thomas Norris, went deep into enemy-held territory in a series of night missions to bring out American airmen shot down behind the lines. an ordeal of nerve and endurance carried out alongside a South Vietnamese frogman named Nguyen Van Kiet, who received the Navy Cross for his own part in it. That autumn, Norris was himself terribly wounded on another operation, and a SEAL named Michael Thornton ran back through heavy fire, lifted him, and carried him into the sea. Then kept him afloat and swam with him for hours until a boat found them. Thornton became the first man to receive the Medal of Honor for saving the life of another man who would himself receive that same honor. There is no other recorded instance of two such recipients in the very same action. Those were the peaks. Beneath them lay the long, ordinary grind of the war, the thousands of quiet ambushes and patrols and captures that never made a headline, and the price the community paid for them. Something on the order of 3,000 SEALs served across the whole of the Vietnam War. Of those, the memorials record roughly 46 to 48 who did not come home. It was a small number against the vast toll of that war, and an enormous number against the size of the brotherhood that bore it. By the end of 1971, the last SEAL platoon had left the country, and the last advisors followed a little over a year after that, and the direct chapter of the green-faced war was closed. What that chapter leaves behind is worth sitting with, because it cuts against the way we usually imagine elite warriors. We picture them as men made superhuman by their training, and the training was real and brutal, and it mattered. But the deeper truth of the SEAL in Vietnam is that his hardest and most important schooling did not happen on the beach at Coronado at all. It happened in the mud of the Delta, in the patience he had to learn and the bravado he had to shed, in the quiet corrections of men only a little less new than himself. The frame was forged in California. The soldier was finished in the swamp, and the finishing was never about one glorious moment. It was about the slow mastery of small disciplines that no medal would ever mark, the kind of competence that reveals itself only in the men who came home and in the missions that ended in silence rather than disaster. The young volunteer, who had once raised his hand at a recruiting office and who had refused to quit when quitting was offered to him every single day, became a man his squad could stake their lives on. Not because he had won a decisive battle, but because he had earned, patrol by patrol, the trust of people who did not give it easily. In time, he would be the veteran. He would be the worn, quiet figure watching a wide-eyed newcomer step off a boat, seeing his own first days written plainly on the young man's face, and he would begin, without ceremony, to teach him. That was how the knowledge passed hand to hand in a community too small and too secret to hand it down. Any other way, the men with green faces were never numerous, and their war was fought mostly in a darkness the cameras never reached. But in the still hours along the canals of the Mekong Delta, a handful of volunteers learned to outwait, outthink, and outfight an enemy on his own ground, and they left behind a standard that the men who came after them would spend the rest of the century trying to live up to.